Joining the panel now is Liberal MP Keith Wallachan, who's been described as a WeChat star, which I was reading today, and I believe everything I read. So it is a Chinese-owned social media app. It's been sort of shunned previously. Has there been an edict to say, hey, this is okay to use, and why, if so?
Not an edict. I, on the current boundaries, have the third largest Chinese diaspora in Australia, and on the new draft boundaries, we'll have the largest diaspora in Australia. On the census, it will be 29%. And what we know is that particularly migrants from China in the last 10 years, when they have been there, they use WeChat, or there's another platform called Red. And so as a parliamentarian, if you want to hear from your community and communicate back to them, you go to the platforms where they are. So it makes sense that in seats like mine, that we engage on that social media.
Did the coalition stuff it up last time, do you think?
I don't think they stuffed it up. And
because the context of that was, the context of that question is Josh Frydenberg. There was a view around his campaign that it was undermined significantly by a large Chinese Australian vote in the seat of Kooyong, and there was a significant backlash against the position of the Morrison government, or more, not so much the position, but the tone of their message.
There is no question that throughout seats, particularly in metropolitan Melbourne and in metropolitan Sydney, like mine, the swings were larger, and they were larger particularly with the Chinese community. And we did lose some of that connection that we have. We've had a strong tradition of Chinese Australians and the Liberal Party for good reason. That Chinese Australians much more likely to be entrepreneurs, starting their own businesses, much more likely to put a premium on supporting their children, going to quality education, public and private, and much more likely to be concerned about our community being safe. And I know in Melbourne that is a top-tier issue at the moment, that many Chinese Australians feel like the city of Melbourne is not a safe city at the moment, and that is coming through very clearly on WeChat and on Red.
On WeChat, though, back at the time, James Patterson said it was potentially a foreign interference concern, and that's why they were looking at potentially you should come off this, particularly on government devices. Has that foreign interference concern gone away, or have you just realised this is a good way to connect with voters?
All of us use all of the platforms with eyes wide open as to the risks associated with them, and those risks can be mitigated. They can be mitigated in what phones that you have them on, whether you don't use them in certain scenarios.
So not on your work phone?
All of the same protocols that apply to TikTok, we apply here.
Sure, it's easier just to not have it at all. Do you have TikTok on your phone?
I have a separate phone that has TikTok, WeChat and Red, so it's not a phone that's connected to my other government applications.
Would you encourage some of your other colleagues to get on board this, a new way of communicating with certain sections of the community?
I would encourage my colleagues to go onto the platforms where their constituents are. So for those with a Chinese diaspora in the teens or 20s, and there's about 15 that are for the coalition, I would encourage them to do that, and many are. It's a matter for each member or candidate whether they do. But so far, I've learnt an enormous amount. For instance, I've picked up particular issues that have happened in my community that weren't reported in the press, including a carjacking, particular break-ins, and I get then to represent them with the police and also my state colleagues. It's been really useful and instructive.
Did you pick up anything different in terms of the Visa Gaza issue?
I did, yeah. So that issue is being discussed, and there is widespread support for Peter Dutton's position on this, because what all migrants know, and I'm a migrant myself, is that it takes a huge amount of work and disappointment and heartache and time to get here, because Australia is worth it. But to see that this process has gaps in it and that questions aren't being answered, particularly when it comes to keeping Australians safe, that is of great concern in that community, and that's why we're continuing to ask these questions.
How is Peter Dutton being received in Victoria? We know there are issues at a state level, have been for some years now, trying to get a bit of momentum behind the Liberal Party. There's a number of seats in those inner city areas that are marginal. We think back to Aston. I know that's a while ago now. But how's his image changed? Is it being perceived better? What's that like these days when you walk the streets?
Yeah, well, looking back on the Aston by-election, it is clear that that was the high point of the Prime Minister's honeymoon period in the community, and the results showed that. Over the last 2.5 years, Australians and Victorians in particular have got to know Peter Dutton. And that includes moments like the Budget in Reply, where we get to hear Peter talk about his very personal experiences. But in the many visits to Victoria, including in my community, we've seen the warm, confident Peter that I know and respect. And people in Victoria are warming to him because they're worried about cost of living, they're worried about security, and they see Peter Dutton as someone who has their interests at heart.
In the headlines today was a launch at Teal seats. What's changed in a policy sense that would make the people who voted Teal vote Liberal this time?
Our policies will be released in due time, and we're going.
But is there anything out there
process.
yet that would appeal to them?
Well, I think one of the things that I took from many things that I took from the 2022 election is how we conduct ourselves. I think tone does matter, and I think the Teals are quite right to raise issues like the tone of question time. Now, I don't agree with the extent that they've gone to or the hypocrisy that they've shown in how they do it, but I do think in some of those seats, it doesn't hurt to sometimes say, maybe we got that wrong, or it doesn't hurt to say, maybe the opposition have done this right. I think
would you say that on any policies, though?
Well, if you should do it if it's true.
So it's not?
Sure, if it's true. For example, I personally had issues with the way robo-debt was conducted. And I said so publicly, but I find when you do that, then people lean in and listen to what you have to say next. And I think that matters particularly in Teal seats.
Do you think in terms of Peter Dutton's popularity, would it extend to you having him all over your sort of seat, or is it more future leader Keith Wallahan that might go a bit better?
Certainly not. I think what we know is that elections are more presidential. Whether we like it or not, that's going to happen. So Peter Dutton will be on our material. And again, I'm new to this. This is my first time seeking re-election. But if you don't do it, your opponent will. And they will seek to paint him as a cartoon villain.
So you need good Duts next to bad Duts because he'll be there anyway.
Well, good Duts is the true Duts. So I think that's the one that should be there.
Do you think, in terms of the political equation at the moment, obviously you know this, we've spoken about it a lot, the cost of living pressures are the things that are really driving people's focus at the moment. Is the single-minded focus you had on the refugee visa question the last 10 days, was it smart politically given where the priorities are for people?
What we know is that the only reason this has been a focus of question time after question time is because the Prime Minister has been evasive. If he actually answered the questions on day one, we wouldn't be talking about it. But this is above cost of living, is the safety of Australians. So we have a duty to prosecute this, and we will keep prosecuting it until the Prime Minister gives straight answers.
Keith Wallahan, always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.